Hi, I'm Professor Barbara Bruns from Georgetown University, the Center for Global Development and part of the RISE Research and Improving Systems of Education Network. Today I'm going to talk about the third big challenge that education systems face in producing great teachers. It's motivating their teachers. Let's stop for a minute and think about what makes people want to be teachers and work hard throughout their professional career. What makes this teacher pictured stay after school to teach her students? What makes high school students compete for entry into teacher training schools in Finland or Korea or Japan or Singapore? What makes teachers continue to teach in Benin when they haven't been paid in 2 months? And what makes some teachers in Pakistan and India produce the same learning results for their students despite 30 to 50% lower salaries? I think it's good to reflect on this because spoiler alert, the answer is not money. It's important to see that what motivates people to want to be teachers and to work hard is not just the pay. It's a multitude of factors, some of them professional, some of them accountability pressures from their school system, and some of them the intrinsic desire to help children learn. So from the system standpoint, it's very important that education systems achieve balanced incentives that are aligned with learning. Professional rewards for teaching, the financial incentives for teaching, and the accountability for pressures on teachers all have to be in an alignment that produces people who are motivated to put in effort and have the skills and capacity to make those efforts count for children. I've circled a couple of these in red because there's some of the areas that education systems have the most trouble with, very often in the public sector, the issues of job stability, the issues of fear of dismissal or no fear of dismissal, the issue of managerial and peer feedback, and the issue of regular performance evaluation. So what leads to problems like this? A teacher in rural India whose children are sitting out in the courtyard while he sleeps in the classroom. And there's another teacher just on the other side of the wall continuing to teach. And problems like documented in the service delivery indicators research by the World Bank in unannounced visits to 6 African countries, schools, representative samples of schools in 6 African countries, between 14 and 27% of teachers absent that day, and an even higher share absent from the classroom. So is the problem financial incentives? What we know about teacher pay in developing countries is that it's often relatively high in per capita GDP terms. And we see also in many countries what we call public sector rents, equivalent teachers getting paid much more in the public sector than teachers with the exact same credentials in the private sector. And in fact, in many cases, teachers are teaching in private schools, queuing, waiting for public sector jobs to open up. And in Kenya, their wage would double. India, the wage would go up 5 times. And in Pakistan, research by the Pakistan RISE team shows that 30% cut in teachers' wages did not lower learning results. And in Indonesia, I think we'll hear from the Indonesia RISE team about the experience in doubling teacher pay and finding distressingly that there was no impact on student learning outcomes. Other factors related to financial incentives, on top of financial incentives, are that teacher contracts include civil service job stability and attractive pension benefits. Even in places where the pay is relatively low, those are very attractive incentives for teachers. Another thing is that pay tends to increase automatically with seniority, so you don't have to worry about putting in effort throughout your career to know that every 5 years you'll get promoted a grade and get a higher salary. And no differentiation of pay with performance. So you can have 2 teachers teaching very differently with very different effectiveness inside the same school, and one getting the same salary despite the difference in their performance, their effort, and their results. So the bottom line is those things happen because the sources of accountability pressure in the systems are weak. And the two key policy levers for accountability pressure are having a system of regular teacher performance evaluation that makes promotions contingent on your evaluated performance and how well you do, and gives you a credible risk of dismissal if you don't do your job well. And the second big policy lever education systems have is to make their school leaders people who can motivate, encourage, support, and really demand performance from their school teams. So I think the Indonesia team is going to talk about the reform they did in Indonesia to try to upgrade teacher quality by creating a certification standard and raising a big salary increase. So I'm going to talk about how Latin America has tried to tackle this problem over the last 15 years with what we call career path reforms. Peru in 2012 introduced a new career path with an extended career trajectory with the top level 260% higher than the previous average pay, with hiring and promotions based on tests of content mastery and classroom observations of classroom practice, plus interviews, and performance evaluations every 3 years, with the risk of dismissal, according to the law, after 2 unsatisfactory evaluations. And you can see from the numbers, massive numbers of teachers have taken the tests. The entrance test to get into this new, better paid career path was very challenging. And the numbers every year that have passed it and then finally passed the second phase of demonstrating their classroom practice and interviews and actually gotten hired has been a low fraction of the total number of teachers who were competing for those civil service jobs. But as the minister at the time said, bringing a teacher into the civil service is like a marriage. It's a long-term commitment, and you have to make your choices very carefully. Ecuador similarly doubled the average salary when they reformed the career ladder in 2007, also introduced hiring tests, strict tests of content mastery, plus a teaching demonstration. And Ecuador went a step further to try to attack the problem of low-quality pre-service teacher training by closing a number of teacher training schools and changing the teacher education curriculum. And they raised the test score for entry into teacher training, and also have mandatory performance evaluations every 4 years that include content tests, classroom observations, peer and student feedback. And they similarly took away guaranteed civil service job stability. Teachers who had consecutive poor evaluations could be fired. I think I mentioned earlier that in Ecuador, they also had the opportunity to clean the house by offering an attractive retirement bonus for teachers and directors who did not want to enter this new career path where they were going to have higher performance pressures and be evaluated regularly. And so in the end, about 40,000 teachers and directors, 25% of the entire force, retired by 2012. And that has really made space in the system to hire younger and better trained teachers. Chile in 2016 doubled the starting salary and a 50% higher top salary. Also, higher standards for teacher education. I think we talked about this in an earlier module. And regular performance evaluation of the content mastery and classroom practice of teachers, videos graded by experts. And all promotions are based on evaluated performance. Teachers who do not advance on the expected trajectory through the first 3 levels of the new teacher career path is sort of like a induction period that will be dismissed, will be counseled out. And most recent research confirms the impact that these higher standards have had on student learning. So the bottom line is that the Latin American countries and what we call the Andean countries have had this compact over the last decade and a half, with the central bargain being much higher salaries a decompressed salary scale, much better expectations of how you can project and how you can perform and improve your salary over your career, of your lifetime career, in exchange for competency test-based recruitment, an end to seniority-based promotion, and comprehensive performance evaluation at regular intervals, and very importantly, an end to civil service job stability with this a credible threat of dismissal for poor performance. And these reforms are designed both to motivate current teachers, what we call an effort effect, and attract higher caliber people into the profession, a selection effect. So I said in an earlier segment, the issue is that it's very hard to evaluate these kinds of system-wide reforms rigorously because they're implemented across the whole system, and it's hard to also unpack which particular elements, since they're so comprehensive, which particular elements are the most important drivers of teacher behavior, teacher motivation, and teacher effectiveness. But in all three countries, Chile, Peru, and Ecuador, this reform package has led to sustained, significant learning gains. The second big lever or policy area that school systems have to work with is motivating teachers through management. In Brazil, in the Rio de Janeiro system that I was working with, they did not have a comprehensive reform of teacher performance evaluation. But if you this example is a kind of a typical one. If you go to a high performing school, and I asked the director, how did she manage to transform the school's learning outcomes, and how did she manage to transform it from a failing school where very few students were enrolled to a school of 5 full enrollment with a waiting list? She said she changed 80% of her teaching force. And I said, how do you do that? You don't have the power to fire teachers. And she said, I made their life hell. I would sit in their classrooms, observe, give them feedback. After a certain point, if they could not absorb the feedback and do a better job, I really found ways to get them to move elsewhere in the system. I mean, that's a big challenge for school directors, but that's typically how it's done. And since U.S. Research in the United States on school leadership has found kind of similar patterns that Bruns, Hanashek, and Rivkin analyzed Texas data to study how student learning outcomes at the school level changed after changes in principle. And they use that to estimate the value added of principles. And they found that it's kind of similar to the research on individual teachers, that there's a big range in principal effectiveness, and that the top of highly effective principles can raise the learning of students by 2 to 7 months in a single year. That's less than an individual teacher can do typically at the classroom level. But you think that this principle is achieving that impact on hundreds of students. And it's a really highly leveraged improvement in system performance. And they tried to analyze how did the principles raise learning. And the key thing they found was that it was by managing teacher turnover. They analyzed the entrance and exits of teachers into those schools with the most effective and least effective principles. They found that the least effective principals had a lot of turnover in the school. Teachers were actually trying to get out. But in schools with the highest quartile principals, the principals that scored highest in their performance distribution, they found that there was a very selective teacher turnover, that the teachers who left the school were leaving from the grades with the lowest test scores, and the teachers in the grades with the highest test scores would stay in the schools. And the pattern was most pronounced, this was interesting, in high poverty schools. So where the principal quality made the biggest difference in the schools with the least resources. Because think about it, those schools have the hardest time attracting good teachers. So if you have a good principal, someone that people respect and want to work with, It's a very powerful strategy for attracting better teachers. There's been a very interesting work lately by Professor Lever, Renata Lemos, and Daniela Skur, using a global management survey that has been well validated and used a lot to measure management in business. It's been adapted to use in education. And what they have been doing is looking at the PISA school questionnaires and mapping those domains onto the World Management Survey in order to create a measure of management quality within schools. And they were able to do this in PISA countries and also in Brazil, across Brazil on a large scale, because Brazil has a national student assessment, which also has very good school survey data. And some of the dimensions you can see here, some of the questions they ask: how do you manage performance? How do you use school results and feedback in your work with your teachers in your school? And what they found was that there are clear correlations between the quality of school management from the principal's scores and the students' test scores for those schools, both in the PISA countries and in the Brazil test score data. And they've also, because the survey covers these different elements of principals' behavior, they're able to zero in on what are the key skills. And the number one is good people management. They find that in the schools with the highest performance and the highest rated managers, they avoid teacher shortages, they manage teacher selection, they're deselecting, encouraging weaker teachers to leave, and they're directly working with teachers to stimulate higher effort. They also find that the high-rated managers have good operations management. They focus on promoting quality in the classroom. They encourage teachers to adopt best practice educational strategies, such as question and answer interactive teaching, to adopt technology in the classroom. They focus on results. They track student assessment data. They use it in their meetings with their staff. They try to drive change and improvements through dialogue and meetings, focused on the challenges of continuing to improve school results. And the third thing they found as part of good operations management was stimulating higher parent engagement, that the highest rated school managers were able to mobilize parent support for the students and the school and get the community engaged in the school. A very recent study by Karthik Muralidharan in Andhra Pradesh, India, has used the same instrument to try to compare the management skills of public and private, of school principals in public and private schools. And there's a huge difference in the people management dimension. So I think, and to be fair, I think that reflects the fact that the public sector in many education systems does not give principals the power to change their staff very easily. So that's what one thing that comes from the research is that the principals who are effective in producing school level results find ways to maneuver within those system constraints and attract the teachers they want and move out the teachers that they don't think are performing well. To sum it all up, so if you're in a situation where you need to move from a very low level equilibrium where, you have problems of absenteeism, you have problems of, teachers not being in the classroom, even though they're in the school, if you have, teachers really not putting in the effort with their students, it requires strategies for, first, attracting more talent into teaching through higher selectivity at entry, which you can't abstract away from the fact that it means that the overall mix of incentives needs to be competitive with other sectors. You have the challenge of raising the quality of initial teacher preparation. You have the challenge of putting in place a meritocratic teacher hiring process. You have the challenge of making sure that the money you spend on professional development is effective. And we have some research to guide investments, high quality supports, sometimes use of scripted lesson programs or high caliber textbooks, or in Japan, teachers working together on lesson study, a collaborative design of the best way to teach this or that element of the math curriculum, and coaching and encouraging school level collaboration among teachers. Because as I've said before, the research shows that in every school, there are some high performing teachers. There are some teachers that are very motivated and have real talent. And if there's a way to create a culture within the school where those teachers, instead of being ostracized or resented, can work with others and help transfer lessons and improve everyone's performance, it's really a win-win. And the fourth element is structuring the career path so that it rewards performance, ending automatic promotion and finding ways to make sure that teachers get promoted and higher salaries in line with their individual performance, and finding a way to eliminate job stability for chronic low performers. As Michelle Rhee said when she introduced a big reform of this in the Washington, D.C. schools, she said, I'm a parent. I have my children in the D.C. public schools. And if there's a very ineffective teacher in that classroom, one day is too long to have that person teaching my children. So this is up to the system to find ways to identify those chronic low performers and find ways to ideally have a career path legislation that allows them to be fired, dismissed for chronic low performance. And the last thing, going to the big impact that school leaders can have on their schools, is meritocratic selection of school leaders. There are many countries where school leaders are appointed through political connections, through connections with someone in the school system, connections with the teachers union, and we know that that's not the way, that does not necessarily produce the best school leadership. So systemic reforms of the teacher career path, why it's so important is that it attacks all of these elements. But there are a lot of places where comprehensive reforms like those of Ecuador, Chile, and Peru are just not possible. So there's been a lot of work that economists have done trying to find second best solutions when you can't reform the overall incentives in the system. One big one is outsourcing to the private sector. Charter schools in the United States, Chile has voucher schools, Liberia had a partnership schools initiative, and also allowing a low-cost for-profit school sector to expand, which has been a very big factor in India and Pakistan. And I hope the RISE colleagues from those countries will be talking more about this. But I would have to say that looking broadly over a couple of decades of experience and evidence, there's really relatively little evidence that competition between public and private schools raises public school quality and is enough to drive improvement in the overall learning results of the system. And some of the solutions have involved trying to bring parental voice into the schools by having parents on school management committees. And I think, a grosso modo assessment of the literature, the evaluation evidence on that, is that parental voice is often not sufficiently empowered to actually be a factor in driving school improvement. Bonus pay is another proxy strategy as a substitute for comprehensive career path reform. And there's been a lot of research evidence evaluating all kinds of different bonus pay designs because it is something, unlike career path reforms, it is something that can be introduced in an experimental randomized trial and studied very carefully. And we've learned a lot of things about how different bonus pay designs can work. And there's some evidence that well-designed group bonuses for school results can stimulate schools to focus on learning and increase teacher effort. But there's less evidence that these bonus pay initiatives have any impact on selection into teaching. I think for the simple reason that most of them are not sustained that long. They tend to be 2 or 3 year experiments, and that's not enough to really change the profile that the that teaching has in attracting young people into teaching. And the data requirements for doing a good bonus pay system are non-negligible. You have to have school level learning data, and you always have to worry about stimulating gaming or cheating. Some of the most there's numerous cases where there's been widespread cheating in United States schools in the presence of a bonus program, including in my town of Potomac, Maryland. The school director walked around the classrooms actually telling students the answers on the state assessment. And one third grader went home and said, "Mom, is that normal that the director should be telling us the answers on the test?" And so there became a scandal, and she was fired, and et cetera. But you can imagine that that's human nature that's a temptation in almost any setting. The last area is non-salary professional rewards, like non-prizes, bonus, recognition for excellence. But again, those tend to be relatively small-scale programs, not sustained very long, and relatively little evidence of impact, and certainly not evidence that it changes the profile of teaching and who goes into teaching and how hard teachers work across their career. This is just a summary from a paper. It's actually a couple of years old, and I'm sure there are many more cases since then. But the bottom line is there's a wide range of designs, targets, tournaments, pay for percentile. There's wide variation in what's rewarded. Is it for test scores? Is it for multiple factors? There's a big range in the size of the awards. But most evaluated cases are relatively short-term experiments. And in Andhra Pradesh, India, one of the best designed such evaluations, the first year results were very different from the results after 5 years of implementation. So to conclude, for sustained learning progress, I really believe there's no substitute for system-wide reform. But system-wide reform is not easy. And how to manage the political challenge will be my final topic. Thank you very much.